And our recording is in progress, which is good. So I'm going to put up my notes for today. And we will pick up right where we left off. I may not get to all the questions I got, but they are very thoughtful. So I'm really glad for that. We were talking a little bit about the story of Adam and Eve. And one of the questions I got was, wouldn't God have known that Eve and Adam were going to eat from the tree, since surely God knew this was a test they would fail just because they're human? You know, if you tell a child not to do something, there's, you know, that's exactly what they want to do, right? So why does God test them? And it's a very high level question, because it's really about God and why God does certain things, especially if God knows what the outcome is going to be. There are two possible answers in my view. One of them is God changes his mind about the Garden of Eden. You know, if God changes her mind, it's because the Garden of Eden doesn't work out well. Adam and Eve do not grow up because they don't have to work. And so God gives them a test that they will fail. My teacher, Dr. Byron Sherwin, of blessed memory, once wrote a short essay called Portrait of God as a Young Artist, depicting this, this God who makes mistakes. And, he sees that it's not working out well with Adam and Eve. So he sets up the test, he throws out the garden. And this is consistent with the destruction of the world in the time of Noah. Right? The other possibility is that the story is a setup, and it's really about the nature of human beings. So, and if that's the case, you don't have to pass judgment on God, for giving an impossible test. This is a teaching about the value of work, of independence, of responsibility. I think I mentioned last week that the book of Job is clearly fiction. It is a setup, much like the story of the test of Adam and Eve. Now, the fact that it's not a historical event, just as the 7 days of creation are not a historical event, it doesn't mean that it can't be sacred wisdom about the nature of human beings. And both of these explanations have to do with responsibility. Well, I don't know about anybody else here, but I have days when I would like to be totally free from all my responsibilities. Years ago, when my kids were young, I came across a nursery rhyme that said, nothing to do, put some mayonnaise in your shoe. It's like, if you don't have anything to do, you're probably going to do something stupid, right? So that's, it's a memorable lesson. So, what would I do if I had no responsibilities? Would I spend all day watching Netflix? Would I go shopping for stuff that I don't need? No. If your to-do list magically disappeared, what would you do? I think you'd have to get a new one, right? Because it's from responsibility that we grow. Honestly, it took me a very long time to learn this, but I did, not because I was so smart or because I was so ambitious, but because I didn't have a Garden of Eden to fall back on. So, and by the way, the end of the story of the Garden of Eden has, angels with a flaming sword to make sure they don't go back. And that's, you can't go back. You can't go back to not having responsibility. That's part of life. Another question about this story. It says, I have heard many explanations of what the serpent is or what it represents from a Christian perspective, but why is the serpent the one that undermines Adam and Eve? From the Jewish perspective, does it have special symbolism? The short answer is yes. Right? Now, in Christianity, the serpent is associated with a whole host of bad qualities, but especially temptation, and most especially sexual temptation. Right? Christianity has a real problem with sex. Maybe not as much today as it did in its origins, but certainly had a problem. However, in the biblical period, snakes also symbolized rebirth and renewal, in addition to some other things. So yeah, the snake is a liar, a clever deceiver, but also it has an important good quality. And that is a quality that human beings need, which is, sometimes you have to be reborn. You have to renew yourself in a new situation. Jewish commentary on the snake says that this either is or symbolizes what we call the Yetzer Hara, right? Very important term in Jewish thought. Everybody has a Yetzer Hara, an evil impulse. We also have a good impulse. And the trick is learning how to manage the evil impulse and harness it in the service of the good. So, if you happen to know someone who just has no ambition and no desire to accomplish anything, what would you say about such a person? You'd say, this guy's pathetic, right? He doesn't seem to need to do anything. He doesn't feel any responsibility to accomplish something, do something useful with his life, right? Well, that actually comes from the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara means ambition. The Yetzer Hara means desire, sexual desire included, right? The desire to be somebody, right? The rabbis say that if you didn't have a Yetzer Hara, no one would ever get married. No one would ever build a home. No one would ever accomplish anything, right? Now, everybody has, at least, I don't know anyone who doesn't have one. If you dig deep enough, you'll find it. Everyone has a Yetzer Hara as well as a Yetzer Tov, a good inclination. It usually takes a little time to learn how to manage it, right? And that's the trick with growing up, right? If you remember watching cartoons, either when you were kids or when your children were kids, right? There's a device that I'm convinced was invented by a Jewish writer. You would see this cartoon character with two little characters on his shoulders, right? You have the little angel, this person is, or usually a child or an animal, right? Is confronting a choice. And we all know what the right choice is. This one, this person or animal has, this little angel on his shoulder telling him, now, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't get into trouble. And then there's the little red guy with the pitchfork on the other shoulder, right? And he says, go ahead, you're gonna have fun. It's gonna be so much fun, right? Of course, it never works out that way, right? Whatever fun there is in it is something they're inevitably gonna pay for somewhere down the road, right? but we all have that. And in those cartoons, the angel and the devil both have the same face as the character with the two on his shoulder, right? So you just, you make your choice, but you have the two impulses within you. And hopefully most people learn how to manage that and to work with that. Okay? So that's what the Yetzer Hara is all about. Something I think very important for Jewish kids to learn, okay? And for adults as well. Okay? Let me stop here and ask if there are any questions or comments. All right.
Well, wait, I have a question.
Please.
So the reading that we had from that other gentleman, kind of a podcast type thing.
Yeah, the from Rabbi Soloveitchik.
Yeah. Well, he quotes Genesis by saying, and God said, let us make mankind in our image after our likeness. Who are the other people that God's talking to?
Oh, a great question.
I mean, why did it get interpreted with us and our?
I will give you two answers to this. There's the traditional answer found in, the biblical commentaries, the classical Jewish biblical commentaries. And then there's what I think is the right answer. The classical answer is God is talking to his animals, who are the ones who are already created at that point. When he says, let us make man, who else can he be talking to after all, right? And in so doing, God is showing his humility. Now, I find that kind of far-fetched, but at least there's an ethical lesson in it. If even God can be humble, then maybe the rest of us should have a crack at it, right? I worry about humility. My problem is that every time I feel like I'm getting somewhere in that direction, I start to feel proud about it. So it's just kind of an ongoing problem, and you have to work on it. The other answer, I think, is that God is including the animals in the creation of human beings. Human beings are basically a combination of the divine and the animal, right? This is who we are. We have common characteristics with the animals. We have certain impulses, and we also have the capacity for higher understanding and higher morality, right? And so the question is, again, just right back to the Yetzer Hara question, which one is going to prevail? So that question starts out from the very beginning of the Torah. Okay? Any other questions at this point? All right, let's go back to the text. And one other thing about the Yetzer Hara, and Telushkin includes this story in his book from his friend and sometimes co-author Dennis Prager, who says this: when was the last time you heard a mother complain to her 3-year-old, Johnny, stop giving your toys away to all the other children? Well, I mean, maybe you have a kid or a grandkid like that, and that, who's, in the running for sainthood, or at least has a gift for empathy, or, possibly could lose it when he becomes a teenager, but, maybe in the right direction for a while. And so the point of this is we're not naturally good. Right? We have to be taught to be good. We have to be taught to cultivate the good impulse. Because otherwise, we might just carry on and let our evil impulse move us wherever. Right? There is this piece in the 6th chapter of Genesis, where it's, right before God brings the flood. And it says, the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, and how every plan devised by his mind was nothing but evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. Well, imagine saying that about one of your children, right? We all have moments, but it's just moments usually, right? But seriously, God is in a bad mood, and he's reflecting on all the bad things that God's children have done. And he realizes that the way he set it up from the beginning is not working out well. Right? People need a little more guidance than apparently the generation before the flood got. Right? And so, next question, when God decides to destroy the world in the flood, is it an impulsive act of wrath, which feels like a very human reaction, or is it a rational decision for a do-over? And the same thing with the flood. The stories are often told as if God is being vengeful, which is a little different from being angry, but, rational. So what does the text actually say? And the answer is the text about the flood says God's heart was saddened. It looks like a vengeful act, and we'll see something similar later on when Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. And I'm not sure that it's rational by human standards, but the text leads me to believe it's more out of God's sadness. God is saying, I have failed, right? So if God forbid you have 4 children and one becomes a drug addict and one becomes a murderer and one becomes a thief and one becomes a sexual abuser, how would you feel? Well, you would know how God felt in the time of Noah, right? Don't think about it too long, okay? These are God's children, and they have failed. And so God is saying, I have failed, just as many parents might say the same thing. The difference is that God, or at least the God of the Bible, can start over again. Now, a little bit about Noah. Noah initially seems to be a very righteous guy, right? After all, he's the one that God picks to save the human race. It's going to be him and his family and his collection of animals in the ark. But just to be a little bit better than the others around you does not impress, right? God says to Noah, build an ark because I'm going to save you and some animals, and I'm going to drown the rest of the world. And what does Noah say? Noah says, okay. Right? Don't argue with authority, right? Well, if my family and I survive, well then, okay. But he doesn't care that much about the fact that everybody else is going to disappear, right? And then what happens when Noah and his family come out of the ark? What's the first thing he does? He plants a vineyard and then he gets drunk. Okay, maybe the experience of taking care of all those animals for a whole year on a smelly ark, right, is, on this, floating ship, right? Might have been a little traumatic. I can understand that. Might be a little survivor syndrome, right? But still, more on Genesis and drinking problems a little later on, right? And by the way, if you know the story, you know that it rains for 40 days and 40 nights, right? Now, you should be suspicious when the Bible gives you a nice round number like that, right? It might be a literary device, right? And in this case, I think it is. Anybody want to take a guess about what's special about the number 40?
The amount of time Moses was on Mount Sinai.
Well, yes, but something more basic. All right, some of you know the answer to this because you have children. That's your hint. 40 is the normal number of weeks of gestation, right? And so 40 is a number that symbolizes rebirth. This is about the death of the world, but also its rebirth. Okay? That's the significance of the number 40. And of course, Sinai, you go from Sinai and you spend 40 years in the desert, right? Well, that's also a time of rebirth for the Israelites, right? Okay.
Rabbi, 40 days in the mountain is the birth of the Jewish theology.
Yeah. It takes 40 days for Moses to bring down the tablets with the law. Right?
It's going to take its time.
Yeah, well, but 40 is significant because, again, that symbolizes the spiritual rebirth of the Jewish people. And, I don't take numbers literally, but sometimes there's another meaning behind them. Okay, so Noah is exhibit A, that it's not enough just to be a little bit better than other people, because we see that even after the ark is done with, Noah doesn't prove to be so righteous. He's only righteous in comparison to the people who were around him. So no surprise that 10 generations later, God has another problem on his hands. Okay? But he's already promised that he's not going to destroy the whole world like he did with the flood. He said, not going to do that twice. So he decides that maybe we'll try a different tack. We're gonna develop a group of people who try to live by certain principles and serve as an example, as shall we say in the prophetic phrase, a light unto the nations. Okay? And that starts with Abraham. Why does it start with Abraham? What was it about Abraham that made God decide to send him on this mission? It may be, there's not a clear answer to this in the Bible, but it may be because Abraham believes in one God and listens to God. Maybe he understood that there could only be one God, one force behind the universe, right? And a few examples about Abraham, right? He listens to God when God tells him to go to a new home. Leave your birthplace, leave your family, or, take your wife and your nephew and, a few people along the way and You're going to go to a new home, to a land which I will show you. Lech lecha, go forth. Now, if somebody, told you, let's put it this way, if you heard a voice telling you to move to another country, you don't know anyone there, no family, you don't own any land, maybe even the schools aren't so good, what would you do? Right? Abraham starts packing. That's faith. Right? Abraham is also important because he is willing to challenge God for the sake of what is right. We see later on in the story, God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, you're going to what? How can to do such a thing, to destroy the righteous together with the wicked? Surely there are some righteous people in this city. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Right? Which, of course, is a lesson for the future. Yes, God wants justice, and we are supposed to want and work for justice as well. Right? A little more on Sodom and Gomorrah later. Right? And a third example of this, Abraham has faith in God's promises. God tells him when he is very old and his wife is very old, he says, you'll have a son. Ha! Ha! We're so old. But Abraham doesn't laugh. Abraham is patient. And eventually it happens. Now, very important note. Definitely by the standards of his time, Abraham is a good person, but Abraham is not a perfect person. And if you go to synagogue in the next 2 weeks, in person or virtually, or if you just read through the Torah portions, you will see several examples of how Abraham is imperfect. And if you want homework for the next 2 weeks, I don't like giving out homework, but if you want, do that. Read Genesis chapters 12 through 22. And if you don't have questions after that, then you better go back and read it again. All right? The second of the patriarchs is Isaac. Isaac is the passive patriarch. Now, maybe he is traumatized by some events, including his near sacrifice, right? Maybe he is mentally not capable of grasping some of the things that the other patriarchs have understood. He has limited vision, especially as he gets older. So he's handicapped there too. But he doesn't go out and find a wife. Abraham's servant Eliezer is the one who goes, back to the old country to see if maybe he can find an appropriate wife. Don't get him a wife from among the Canaanites in this territory. Well, they're not good people. He goes and he finds Rebecca. Okay? Isaac doesn't see some of the differences between his own sons or the limitations of the older son Esau, the older of the twins. His wife Rebecca is the one who sees. And then there is Jacob, who is really the tragic patriarch. Right? He has friction with his brother, and he has to leave home at a certain point. He tricked his father into giving him the blessing and the birthright, but he in turn is tricked into marrying 2 sisters, Leah as well as Rachel, the one he loves. For many years, he believes his favorite son Joseph is dead, and he's not too proud of some of his other sons either. Right? And that's without knowing what they did to Joseph. Right? And he dies in Egypt, although he insists on being buried back home. So he has some triumphs, but he has a very tough life. God gives him a new name, the name Israel, one who wrestles with God. right? It comes out of the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, but it's a very appropriate name for someone who represents the Jewish people, who fathers the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? Jacob actually wrestles with God, and so do we sometimes. Okay? And all in all, he has 12 sons, and it is mostly because of this, that there are 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? Also wanted to share this little piece, which Telushkin just mentions the fact of this in his book, but he doesn't give you anything more about it, right? The advanced ages of the patriarchs, and there's a certain geometric progression in it. The point is that these artificial ages suggest a connection between them, right? So you see the pattern: 7 times 5 squared, 5 times 6 squared, 3 times 7 squared. Okay. That's, it, and those are the ages. Okay. So the Jewish Publication Society commentary on the Bible, which is sort of the go-to source if you want modern scholarship from a Jewish point of view, says this about it. Says the paternal chronologies constitute a rhetorical device expressing the profound biblical conviction that Israel's formative age was not a concatenation of haphazard events. It's not a lot of stuff that just happened or that was thrown together. It is a series of events ordered according to God's grand design. In other words, saying that they lived to these years in this progression is a way of saying this is all part of a plan. And that's the way we should read it. Okay. The names of the patriarchs are significant. Abraham comes from the words Av Hamon, which means father of many. Yitzchak means laughter, right? When his mother was told that she would have a child at her advanced age, she laughs, right? Because that's ridiculous. Not going to happen. Crazy. And it happens. And so he is like the one who provoked laughter. Right? Yitzchak. Yaakov is born holding on to the heel of his twin brother, right? Esau comes out first, and it's like Jacob's trying to pull him back, right? So the word is Akev, and Yaakov comes from the heel. He's born grabbing for something more, right? And he is a little bit of a schemer, but he also has spiritual qualities that his brother doesn't have. Okay. Let me stop here and see if anybody has a question. Don't all jump at once. All right. Hearing none. Let's go forward. All right. Let's go to the matriarchs. All right. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. All right. The covenant and in that time Israelite identity may go through the patriarchs, but the matriarchs are not to be underestimated. When Sarah says to Abraham, send, my maidservant and her son, who also happens to be Abraham's son, send them away, right? God says, whatever Sarah says, you do, right? That is also part of the plan, right? Rebecca is the one who connives with Jacob for him to receive his father's blessing. She is also known for her extreme compassion, which is exactly what the messenger was looking for when he picked her out. She waters Abraham's servants' many camels, right? Now, this is one of the other questions I got, that Rebecca seems much more duplicitous than insightful. She's often portrayed as insightful, and she's certainly portrayed as compassionate, but here she just seems to be sneaky, right? So why is she portrayed favorably? Was this just because she had to do certain things in order to fulfill the plan, the destiny? Well, she clearly is duplicitous on this, but part of the reason for that is that she can see what Isaac cannot see. As a woman, she doesn't have the power that Isaac has, right? The Bible, with rare exceptions, reflects patriarchy because that's what was. Judaism did make some stipulations about that along the way, but we will come to that more when we get to rabbinic Judaism, right? But here in the Bible, it's definitely a patriarchal society, but the matriarchs have a way of making their impact, right? She doesn't have Isaac's power, but she can change the course of the family in a way that he can't, right? Isaac cannot see that his firstborn son Esau is a boor, right? He's really, he's a hunter. He's the kind of guy who likes to go out and hunt for food, right? And that's a necessary skill, especially in that time, right? But it's not exactly, the kind of thing that qualifies one for spiritual direction, for spiritual leadership. Esau doesn't have any interest in that. He doesn't show any interest in God. He marries inappropriately. He cares about physical gratification. Now, Jacob has lots of flaws too, but he has potential in a way that Esau does not. And that is what Rebecca sees, even though Isaac cannot see. By the way, the issue of firstborn and secondborn is kind of an ongoing issue in the Torah. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it tonight, but biblical scholars tend to think that this has a point. They're not exactly sure what the point is. It may have to do with changing certain cultural realities and making it clear that being the firstborn doesn't really qualify you for anything special. It takes a long time to change culture, right? If you've ever belonged to a synagogue, you will understand that. You may understand that the synagogue has very high principles, but sometimes the culture thwarts carrying out those principles in the way that would be best for everyone. This is one of those things. It won't be on the final exam for this class, by the way, but it will. It's just something to keep in mind. Firstborn, secondborn, there's the way that it was, and it's not necessarily the way it should be. Infertility is a frequent challenge in the Bible, and certainly with 3 of the 4 matriarchs. And that may be to remind us that passing on the blessings, both the blessings of life and the covenant, are not a simple thing, right? Leah and Rachel, right? They have tragic lives in different ways. Leah is unloved. You know? It's a function of the times when, women were purely chattel, and she was sort of pawned off as a wife for Jacob without him even knowing it. Right? And yes, they could get away with that back then. Right? Her father, man, comes to him and says, in a way that reflects the biblical principle of measure for measure, he says, it's not right to marry off the younger sister before the older sister. You might imagine that resonates with Jacob, who in his sneaky way took over the birthright and the next generation of leadership of his family. Leah, however, eventually seems to come to terms with her circumstances. When she has her fourth child, she at least has children and hopes that her husband will appreciate her for that, which doesn't seem to exactly happen, right? But when her fourth son, Judah, is born, that's the name she gives him, Yehudah, and it says, Odeh et Adonai, I will give thanks to God, right? So it's like she is giving thanks for the blessing she has. Rachel's life is tragically shortened. She is beautiful. She is beloved, the things that Leah is not. But she is for a long time infertile. And then when she has her second child, she dies in childbirth, which of course in that time was all too common. Right? All of these names of the matriarchs and the patriarchs remain among the most common Jewish names. By the way, as I mentioned names, just a little quick thing about naming children in Judaism. There are two groups of Jews. There are those who came from European, Northern European and Eastern European lands, most of which are regarded as Ashkenazi. Ashkenaz is Hebrew for Germany, right? So Jews from Germanic lands and those who moved farther east, they're Ashkenazi, and their custom is to name children after dead relatives, right? Grandparents, great-grandparents, beloved uncles, etc., right? But in an Ashkenazi family, it would be seen as, a bad omen. If you named the child after a living person, it would be as if you were, hoping that the child would replace them. Okay? Whereas Sephardi Jews who come from Sfarad, from Spain, from Spain before 1492, after the Jews were expelled from Spain, they went to North Africa, they went farther east, they went to the Balkans and Turkey. So that's where many Sephardi Jews come from in recent generations. Their practice is to name children after living relatives. Why would you name a child after somebody who's dead? You want to wish them long life, right? So name them after someone who's living. But those are, totally different practices within, the two primary groups of Jews today. Let's stop for a second. Questions? Any questions? Yes, Richard.
Rabbi, I happen to really enjoy our patriarchs and matriarchs because they are, and this may sound funny, but it's real. They are dysfunctional. These are dysfunctional families where we see conflict between siblings, conflict between two siblings, we see rivalry, deception, lies, and especially, and you're exactly right, Jacob, who's really one of my favorite, because he started out as one who deceived his father. He knew what he was doing. He knew he was lying to his dad.
Yes.
But he said, I want for me this right. And just as soon as he got the right, he got the heck out of town. And he fled. And he and he lived in fear for many years until he eventually saw his brother. So I just wanted to tell you that you're exactly right. And I just wanted to tell you my personal view of our matriarchs and patriarchs, that they're real live people. They're not made up.
Or even if they were made up, they're based on real life people, right?
Well, yeah.
The point is, there is no family that is free from some level of dysfunction, because human beings are not created fully functional. If the only way to avoid sibling rivalry is to have one child or to have no children, right? Some sibling rivalry is normal, right? Some of these other things, disagreements between husbands and wives, disagreements about, who should be the leader of the family, right? Or what happens when you have disobedient children, and sometimes really bad children like Jacob, right? These are real life problems, and these are real life people. And yet there is a spiritual idea that runs through the whole story. And that is what seems to bring everyone through to the next level, at least those who stick with those principles. Those who don't stick with those principles are eventually no longer part of the story, right? We don't hear much about Ishmael after, his mother goes off into the desert. The only time we hear about him afterwards is at the burial of Abraham, right? We don't hear much about Esau after his reunion with Jacob. He's just not on the same track, right? He's grown up a little bit too. He's matured some while Jacob was away. And, you don't have to be a spiritual giant to be a decent brother, to not kill your brother because of whatever rivalry you had or whatever stuff he took from you, right? Some people never grow out of that. And that's one of the sad things rabbis have to deal with, by the way. You do a funeral and people at the funeral, part of the family, are not speaking to each other. And who remembers what it was about? Sometimes they don't even remember how it got started. Okay. Any other questions or comments here? All right, let's go back to our text. And let's talk about a very happy story of Sodom and Gomorrah. No, it's really not very happy. So Abraham's nephew Lot comes with him from the old country to the land of Israel. And eventually they split up. Lot goes to live in the city of Sodom. Now, the Bible specifies two sins of Sodom. One of them is lack of hospitality. The other one is where the term sodomy came from. Okay. Ultimately, Sodom becomes known for all sorts of sins. And yeah, this is the same Sodom that Lot went to when he separated from Abraham, and it was conquered by another group, and Abraham fights for it, basically as a favor to Lot. And now 3 angels come to visit Abraham and then Lot. All right. They don't know at the outset that these are angels. They have human appearance. All right. But they are there to warn Lot that the city is about to be destroyed. And again, it's not like Lot is so righteous. It's more kind of a favor to Abraham. Okay? The citizens surround the house when the angels are in it, and they say, send out these men that we may have our way with them, that we may know them. All right, so that's biblical language for sex. What does Lot do? He offers them his daughters instead. What a guy.
What a guy.
Okay? And, you know, why does he do that? I mean, he is clearly more materialistic than Abraham. And maybe he figures that the angels are more important, right? You know, he values the men over the women, even though the men are strangers, right? Unknown to Lot, the angels have special power and they can take care of themselves, and they blind the Sodomites. And then, you know, so then the destruction is going to come. Abraham argues with God over the destruction of Sodom, right? Abraham bargains with God to spare the city for the sake of the righteous minority, saying, shall you destroy the righteous together with the wicked? What if there are only 50 righteous people in this city? God says, okay, if there are 50 righteous people. And Abraham kind of bargains God down to 10. Right? Unfortunately, that doesn't work because there apparently aren't even 10 righteous people in the city of Sodom. But the reason this story is here is very important, and that is to tell us it's permitted to argue with God. You're allowed to criticize God. You're allowed to be angry with God. You just can't avoid God. Right? This is, one of the other questions I had has to do with that. This doesn't seem to be the case in other religions. The kind of relationship that Abraham has where he can actually argue with God and question God's judgment. And that certainly is correct. If you look at Islam, what does the name Islam mean? Islam means surrender, right? Christianity is all about not a whole batch of deeds, not about arguing with God, but accepting faith in Jesus as Redeemer. Neither one really accepts the possibility of challenging God. So there is a huge difference here between Judaism and these other two religions. At root, Judaism is to some degree an intellectual religion. You don't have to check your questions at the door. Many times over the years that I was teaching people who wanted to convert to Judaism, they were floored at the idea that all these questions they had were welcomed, or even that there might not be just one answer, right? And my own feeling, and I think comparative religion, well, it's just my sense. This is not my field of scholarship. It's just my feeling, is that both Christianity and Islam have strong anti-intellectual roots. Now, that's less true now, but it hasn't always been. And I don't mean to denigrate them, but neither one puts the same kind of emphasis on intellectual honesty. One other point about this: if you have confronted the reality of the Holocaust, as most Jews have had to do in the post-war years, you would have to be either in denial or not very thoughtful not to question God. I will deal with that much later in this course because I'm putting off dealing with issues of Jewish belief. But, sometimes we human beings just have to face certain realities, not necessarily to give up faith in God, but to understand that questioning God is often the most honest thing you can do. And God is big enough to handle that, and Judaism consistently affirms it. Lot's family is told not to look back on the destruction of the city. And his wife does, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. So I think the lesson of this is don't be nostalgic about an evil place. Now, sometimes in the face of evil, you can sit on the fence too long. Right? And the good old days were not always so good. I have people who send me all sorts of little emails, and sometimes the theme of them will be the good old days, how simple life was back when we were growing up. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, right? 60s was already complicated. The 50s, oh, sure, it was simple. Yes, if you were white and you had money. Yeah, it was relatively simple then. Right? But otherwise, not necessarily, and there is this tendency we have to glorify the past, to somehow make America great again. Oh, I didn't say that actually, but okay. In the wake of destruction, the lesson of Job's wife is focus on moving forward. All right. My father-in-law is a good example of this, was a good example of this. He survived the Holocaust, and he came to this country, and he married, and he had a family, and he moved forward, and yes, he had nightmares. And yes, as he got older, he took responsibility for sharing his story. He would go to schools and tell people of his experiences during the war, and as a way of trying to educate people about the consequences of prejudice. Okay? I have also known those, and I say this without judgment because different people took terrible experiences differently, and suffered enormous trauma. Right? But some of them were just not able to focus on where they were going, and they only looked back. There is one other possible lesson in the story of the pillar of salt, and that is, it's not appropriate to look upon the suffering of others, even when they deserved it. We should be more compassionate at that. We shouldn't, have this feeling that everybody gets, that if somebody is suffering, then they probably deserved it. That's just not good thinking. And even if they did deserve it, so what? It's not a cause for celebration. Okay, questions before we go? All right. Hope to see all of you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you. All right.